Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Neuroscience and the Linguistic Power of Babel. The story of Babel is the best metaphor I've found for making sense of the monstrous sociological, cultural, and epistemological changes that occurred in many nations in the early 2010s, which gave us the chaos, fragmentation, and outrage that began to set in by the mid-2010s. There are many causes of the transformation, but I believe that the largest single cause was the rapid conversion after 2009 of the early social networking systems, which made it easy for people to communicate with others into social media platforms upon which people stand and perform in pursuit of a publicly quantified prestige and influence. There was a sudden increase in shouting and a decline in listening. There was a loss of shared stories, shared meanings, and human relationships. Jon Haidt. Hi everybody. This is the book I've latched onto that will hopefully act as a glue for some of the ideas that were just contained within that Jon Haidt. I've seen himself refer to himself as Jonathan, but Jon Haidt. And I found it a fascinating book precisely because it adopts a scientific perspective, and I have no training or very little knowledge of science subjects. But luckily, Terrence Deacon has written for a lay audience as well as people gifted in science. And Terrence Deacon is a professor of, and it's hard to put him in he goes across a few boxes, but he is a neuroscientist. He works on evolutionary anthropology. He uses linguistic models to understand the human evolution of the brain. And he's currently at Berkeley. His work taught at Harvard and I think also Boston University. I think I'm right, but it's definitely those three institutions he's had close links with, just to give you some idea of his background. And I came across this book, unfortunately, a bit late in the day for some of the public debates I've had where I've argued both intuitively and from a literature-based humanities background that language is the thing that sets us apart from the animals. And in various online discussions, there was I was just surprised by the kickback. I've mentioned this in previous videos. And when I started looking at the Tower of Babel, this just coincided that I had this on the bookshelf from a while ago, and I started reading it, and I started making links. And that was in the Jonathan Haidt quote, the idea that he can't think of a better metaphor than the Tower of Babel. And in this book, it's not, he makes no, he talks about religion very, very slightly, but he makes no overt references to the Old Testament from memory. But I could just see the links that could be made because the emphasis, as you can see from the title, is the way in which human beings as a species have evolved to make use of symbols. And in this, I've added this to the playlist that I'm now devoting to the Bible and neuroscience, which may sound, as you've seen in the title, an odd combination, but I actually think they mutually illuminate each other. And I can see fascinating parallels and, like I say, mutual illuminations. And I thought it would be interesting to look at this because there will be people who are tourists in the field of the humanities from science. And there will be people like me who, when reading books like this, are tourists in the other direction. I'm a tourist in the science world. And Terrence Deacon doesn't spend a lot of time, if any, talking about the humanity-type subjects. Yet, I can just see so many links. And I thought it would be interesting to see talk on issues that straddle. I think C.P. Snow back in the day referred to the two cultures. The humanities and the sciences very rarely talk to each other. So using this book, I hope will help me in future I'm going to go into a lot of depth, but rather than just trying to sell you the idea of looking at the Old Testament and stories like the Tower of Babel, I want to use figures like Jonathan Haidt and in this case Terrence Deacon to show you how those biblical stories that are seemingly way out of date, completely irrelevant to modern living, actually have profound significance as methods of symbolic, aesthetic representation. And rather than just being theological and only of interest to religious people, I think implicit in Terence Deacon's argument, he does mention religion slightly, but implicit in his argument about the importance of symbolism is a backdoor way into showing the continued relevance of theological texts like the Bible, even if you're not religious. And you don't have to be, and likewise, you don't have to be scientific to see some of the profound implications of what Terence Deacon is talking about. So without more ado, I'll give you an overview of the context that brought me to thinking this is a disproportionately important book. So this idea of linking the Bible and neuroscience. First of all, there's the useful image of Noah's flood, because I'd suggest that the thing that brought the end of the world in biblical time, or the temporary end of previous civilization with Noah's flood, the story of the flood, is the flood of images, the tsunami of banal. Oh, sorry, I was reading the newspaper this morning and there was yet another story about Meghan and Harry. I temporarily lost the will to live. Luckily I didn't, and I'm here. But this idea of the vacuity, the emptiness, the ciphers of human beings that the media tends to be interested in. And an earlier book, I always get the date wrong, was it 1964-ish? It might be, I always get, it's either 1964 or 1968. So you'd think this is quite a dated book, but Daniel Boorstin, The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America, is a brilliant analysis of what Jonathan Haidt was talking about in the first quotation about what happened in the early 2010s. The grounding for those developments that Jonathan Haidt talked about, where there was suddenly an exponential increase in all the problems based upon social media. The groundwork is traced by Daniel Boorstin. This people famous for being famous, this lack of achievement, Harry and Meghan, that nevertheless makes them supposedly hugely important people that we're always looking at pictures of. And then I have looked at Jean Baudrillard with reference to Bop House in a video previously, and I will go back to him again in future because the idea, I just think he's like an amazing Old Testament prophet, and it's one of the ironies of life that a lot of people, if they've ever heard of Jean Baudrillard, will have probably heard of him through bad characterizations that he's somehow a promoter of postmodernism, when in fact he described postmodernism, but he had the persona of an Old Testament prophet. He was scathing about the state. If you read him, I would say properly, he was scathing about the state of a society in which the difference between signs and symbols, which is something I'm exploring today in detail, that distinction, that important distinction that Deacon also makes, has been lost. So this idea of I will explain iconic indexicality sounds like a great phrase, gone mad. I'll explain very shortly these three notions of semiotics in Charles Peirce's work, who Deacon draws upon. And Jean Baudrillard, again, I think he describes in a philosophical, very arch, French way, poetic way almost, some of the key ideas that are also in Deacon. So this is why I got quite excited when I read the Deacon, because I could start seeing these links with very disparate writers. And if you can keep that phrase, iconic indexicality gone mad, when I talk about Deacon's work in detail, you'll see what I mean. The way in which, a shorthand way, it's Jean Baudrillard's notion of simulation, the way in which images of images, copies of copies, have suddenly got out of control. And I think that goes to what Jonathan Haidt was talking about as well, in terms of communication getting out of control. And then I've been wittering on in this channel and elsewhere about what I would call post-literacy. I think that's the society we're in today. And again, I think that's implied in some of the things Jonathan Haidt is talking about. This idea of post-literacy. Of course, we're a literate society. Never have more texts being sent. I'll accept it's a lot of emojis and illiterate chunterings mostly, but never have so many books being printed. There is lots of literacy out there. Paradoxically, in a world where people have never been less literate, well, they have been less literate, but there was an upward curve. People were becoming more and more literate historically, and now we seem to be on the downward curve. And that, Jonathan Haidt's famous as a social psychologist for writing about social anxiety, and in particular with young people. And I'm going to constantly in future, but also a bit today, talk about this link between when you lose the ability to symbolize your experience, and this is what Deacon mentions as a scientist. I would argue in a post-literate world, we lose the ability to process symbols effectively, and this causes anxiety. And from a different angle, Deacon also suggests, he broaches towards the end of the book, The Symbolic Species, he starts to talk about these type of issues. And it reminded me of Soren Kierkegaard, who I have always been planning to do something on in future, but I've always been scared because he is difficult, brilliant and difficult, and trying to find a way to make him vaguely accessible when I myself struggle with him. But I will, because I think his concepts of fear and trembling, sickness unto death, and he did another book helpfully called The Concept of Anxiety. All of these ideas can be related to Terrence Deacon's work. From, again, Kierkegaard's coming from a philosophical, theological angle that's very different to Deacon, but there are quite strong links. Excuse me. So Jonathan Haidt, he mentions, and it is Haidt, by the way, I think I've read on his website somewhere, it's to be pronounced Haidt, so I'm doing it with his own permission. So Jonathan Haidt, he's got an After Babel Substack, which I came across only yesterday, and there's apparently a book in the pipeline that's going to be called After Babel. So my recent fascination with the whole story of Babel seems to be matching with some trends within certain social thinkers at the moment, which is interesting. And you could see from the opening quote I used the way in which Haidt has been drawn to this image of the Tower of Babel. And I particularly liked it in that quote the way he talked about social media platforms, and you can see the link there with a platform standing on it and this notion of the tower reaching up towards the heavens. And I keep saying I will, but I'm just keep trying to sell you the idea of why the Tower of Babel is such an important story, and moreover, why the book of Genesis in the Old Testament is also incredibly rich with potential ideas. So I've already referenced the flood and Noah, but if you pay close attention to the text, you can begin to see the symbolic complexity, and the symbolic complexity within the human brain is what Deacon writes about, and how they co-evolve together. And the conclusion that I'll give you now, that I'm working towards in this video, and I want to develop more and more as I go along, is the concept that Deacon talks about, that the way in which human beings symbolize things is a boon. It's made us completely distinct from all other animals and given us our uniquely human capabilities. But also, it's given us this independent realm of symbols or words or language, literature, all these things that in some senses come back to haunt us. And most importantly of all, according to Deacon, and I completely agree with him, it's only when you have a rich symbolic world that your mind can draw upon that you are then confronted with your own mortality. You can't conceptualize your own mortality without symbolic language, Deacon argues. So my dogs that have some ability to understand language when I'm screaming at them, it's probably the tone of voice rather than the particular words, I'm sure. But I'm pretty also sure that they have no sense of their own mortality. Every day is a fresh day to annoy me. But human beings, this is our curse and boon. And that's a very strong theme in Kierkegaard's work. And Jonathan Haidt's a social psychologist, so I don't think he is as much concerned as Heidegger is about, quite abstract notions of Christian theology. But in Haidt's work on teenagers, I do see the links in the sense that teenagers may not be wondering about their own mortality because at that age you think you're going to live forever. But they are struggling to deal at that stage of their lives with processing symbolic ways of understanding. Their brain's very plastic and it's changing, and they're going through puberty and all these things. And I think that relationship to how we form symbols, how we relate to symbols, and how, for example, in Nietzsche, I've mentioned previously the birth of tragedy, the way in which, according to Nietzsche, the ancient Greeks had a great way of dealing with symbolism in the form of ancient tragedies, where there was the Dionysian, the celebratory, the frenzied aspect of them, but there was also the rational, the dialogue, the ideas within them. And that helped them confront their own mortality. And if you're in a post-literate world where symbolic sophistication is lacking, I'd suggest this feeds into Haidt's notion of why it's an age of anxiety and why teenagers may struggle more than they ever have before, because never have they had more chance to communicate, but the quality of what they're communicating, the richness of the ideas behind it, have never been poorer. And there's that paradox going on. And that links to this, the whole theory, the whole theme of this channel is the lost art of reading and the lost art, the way in which, whether the symbols I'm talking about are textual or visual, we've largely as a culture lost our ability to read these things or be exposed to them anywhere near as much as we used to. And that creates what I'm calling here a symbolism deficit. And I suggest that has quite profound consequences. Excuse me, I need to quickly blow my nose. I apologise. It's the dreaded hay fever. I'm sorry about that. Nothing worse than listening to someone snuffling. But this idea that Terrence Deacon works on, the fact that I've long been moaning about the post-literate society, the lost art of reading, it links just perfectly, now I'm finding, with the scientific approach of Terrence Deacon, this idea that we are a symbolic species, not because books that I admire and art that I admire is necessarily intrinsically important just because I'm an aesthetic snob. But why I've latched onto Deacon's book is I just suddenly feel empowered. He's providing a scientific context for why this stuff actually is important. So he takes this is why he's such a fascinating character. It's a neuro-evolutionary anthropological linguistic approach. So it's a multifaceted approach he takes. And I did my research because I feared I've found a writer who is a bit of a self-publicist. And the book was incredibly well received, is what my research told me, amongst academics and people in related cognate fields. But I think it came out the same year as Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. And ironically, I was reassured because the Symbolic Species book by Deacon never made it as a bestseller. It did, I think it did quite well, but not as well as someone like Steven Pinker, who is, I think, more of a deliberately public-facing intellectual stroke scientist. Whereas Deacon's work didn't really take off. But like I say, amongst all the, I read, I did looked for a pile of academic reviews, and I didn't see much negative at all. So he's not an outlier. These theories aren't, whilst they may have speculative elements, as far as I can see, I hope I'm not proved wrong in the comments, as far as I can see, he's a very well-respected scientist. And this is a quote by a guy called Mark Edmondson, who I recommend. You'll see how you spell his name at the bottom. He's written quite a few books about the importance of reading, which is how I first came across him. And this is from an article he did. I think it's from the Higher Education Chronicle or something in America. It's basically the trade magazine for academics, or the trade journal. So he says, what does it mean to be spoken by language? It means to be a vehicle for expression and not a shaper of words. It means to rely on cliches and pre-formulated expressions. It means to be a channeler of ad speak, sports jargon, and the latest psychological babble. You sound not like a living man or woman, but like something much closer to machine, trying to pass for human. Oh, excuse me, I've got all, like I say, all bunged up, my nasal passage and throat. So if I suddenly go off camera horizontally, it's been nice knowing you all, and thank you for paying attention to the channel. So you never know how you feel or what you want in life, because the words at your disposal are someone else's and don't represent who you are and what you want. You don't and can't know yourself. You don't and can't know the world. And I'm quoting this. It's from this article, The Ideal English Major, because I think this speaks to what Jonathan Haidt was talking about earlier. The idea of the anxiety amongst young people. I think this is the world they're trapped in, that Edmondson is describing, and they don't have the intellectual tools to combat this because it's a post-literate environment that I think Edmondson's describing here. So the businessman prattles about excellent leadership, partnerships, and productivity. And if I hear the word or the phrase moving forward one more time, did I miss the memo where the phrase in the future was just taking out the language and we're all moving forward? But anyway, slight rant there. The athlete drones on about the game plan, the coach one play at a time, and the inestimable blessing of having teammates who make it all possible. The politician pontificates about unity, opportunity, national greatness, and what's in it for the middle class, and they also bang on about change all the time, even though you know the minute they say it, nothing will ever change. That's why they're saying it. When such people talk, they are not so much human beings as tape loops. If you want an embodiment of that, I think people in the UK are currently experiencing a Prime Minister who does a very good impression. But before I, like I say, get myself angry. And I know it's not a funny topic at all, but it slightly made me giggle that this is a graph that Jonathan Haidt uses to show at the point at which, around about 2012, when it all really began to kick off. But notice that the ages 50 plus, there's a decrease in anxiety as everyone in America suddenly realizes they're closer to retirement and they don't have to get up every morning for the same diurnal grind. They start cheering up there's also they're counting their gold-plated pensions. Meanwhile, the 18 to 25-year-olds, not knowing whether to identify as a hyena or whatever that day, are increasingly anxious about absolutely everything. So this is from, there was a follow-up book to The Symbolic Species called The Symbolic Species Evolved. So it's a collection of essays about the Symbolic Species book that came out about 15 years afterwards, I think. I think The Symbolic Species was it 1997? And this book came out in 2012. Apologies if I've got those dates wrong. So Deacon hypothesized that Charles Peirce's distinction between icons, indices, and symbols, don't worry, I'm going to be explaining all of this in detail, signs referring to their object by means of similarity, actual connection, or habit, might be a key to the understanding of the specificity of human language, making the hypothesis that although forms of iconic and indexical communication were present in many species, but only humans built on these to communicate symbolically. So I will be going into detail on what these technical terms mean. But I thought in this introduction to this edited collection, they provide a really good overview. So even if you go back to maybe this slide later on, I think this provides a great summary of everything that's to come. Deacon proposed that the ability to produce and process symbols in the special sense of the word is a key to the general, detached intelligence characteristic of human beings. Some intelligent species, like bonobos and grey parrots, hello dollars mum, might be able to process symbols to some degree. But the systematic use of symbols was taken to be the defining feature of human semiotic intelligence, hence the title of the book, The Symbolic Species. So this will be developed imminently, but this idea that the argument I've had back to me when I've tried to engage with people on this topic is that other animals, not even intelligent species like bonobos or grey parrots, so, bees and, different types of animals have got some basic communication. And that is conflated with human language, or parallels are made. And what Deacon's saying in The Symbolic Species is, all the way through the book, he provides so much scientific evidence, is that there is a profound distinction to be made between communication and human language. They are profoundly different, like apples and oranges, which aren't profoundly different because they're both fruits. But you see what hopefully you get what I mean. And this profound difference relates back to the distinction between icons, indices, and symbols, which is why I'm going to spend some time going into those. But before I do so, just quickly to look at this distinction between indices, icons, and symbols is all about linguistics and semiotics. But as I pointed out earlier, Deacon is also an evolutionary anthropologist. So he talks about how the brain, how he theorizes how we as human beings use symbols when all of the species either only do it at an incredibly limited level or not at all. And that, to understand how we use symbols differently, you have to be able to appreciate the difference between icons, indices, and symbols. But from an anthropological point of view, there's also the question, how did this happen? What was the sudden spurt that made us suddenly become such brilliant symbolic processors? And for that, he provides an anthropological explanation, which, given that I know nothing about the scientific areas, I just found absolutely fascinating. So the discovery of stone tool technology. So it's Australopithecine. Australopithecine. Australopithecine ancestor. So it's a very early, and I don't actually. I'll show you a diagram in a second. So it's one of our pre-human ancestors. I don't think technically it qualifies as part of the human species, but anyway, you'll see on the diagram. So some 2.5 million years ago made it possible to include a larger degree of meat in their diet, but this required male-male cooperation, and the risk of predation made it increasingly difficult with women to participate in hunting, resulting in the classic Stone Age scenario of gathering women and hunting men, the sexist Neanderthal pigs that they were. They weren't even Neanderthals by this stage. This in turn made the connection between the sexes fragile. How could the pregnant mother-to-be know that the father of her child would in fact return with parts of a corpse after having been away in many days with his gang of hunters? How romantic. Here, darling, little bit remnant of the corpse I've brought you. But this is the problem. The specialization from an anthropological point of view starts with when, I think it was when pre-hominoids started using tools, very basic cutting stones and eventually axes. Then that allowed them to butcher meat and to cut up meat much more efficiently. So meat became a bigger part of the human diet. And that led to more hunting. And what then became interesting was in the early days of pre-humanoid and humanoid development, natural selection took place on the basis, obviously, of upper body strength, so big muscly arms. The minute you start using tools, you want dexterous hands. So humans stopped selecting in an evolutionary perspective for sheer brute strength, and dexterity became more important. And allied to that, when this scenario occurs, whereby the men and women are going to be separated, and the implication of what's being said here is you need stronger social bonds. You get stronger social bonds from language ability and the ability to build social ties based upon better communication. So conversely, how could the hunting man know that the mother of his child would not be unfaithful to him during his hunting absence? So it's like a Neanderthal Jerry Springer scenario, making it uncertain it was in fact his own genetic offspring he was busily catching protein for. Moreover, male cooperation is crucial, given the dangers of meat scavengers. And so I was trying to work out whether that was a typo. And so sexual competition must be minimized. In short, all players in this anthropological dilemma have an interest in securing the link to one another. This is the point about social ties need to be stronger. So when there's meat scavenging going on, it's a innately more dangerous process than just gathering plants or nuts and berries, whatever. So there's more specialization, and that led to the need for stronger social ties, and greater facility with language enabled those social ties. So in securing the link to one another. So to Deacon, establishing a socially mediated fidelity was what required symbols' capacities to represent possible future relationships and commitments, the arch example of speech acts, and which introduced selection pressure to evolve cognitive functions for aiding the acquisition and use of symbolic reference. So this is the selection pressure. And I won't spoil the whole, because I'm going to be spending more time on Deacon. But what's unique about human beings is, and what's unique about Deacon's interpretation of how all this happened, is that we essentially have the same brains, although albeit larger than our ape genetic cousins. But we are able to process symbols at an incredibly complex way that apes cannot, despite the fact there's what I think is called an homology. There's a similarity between I don't think there's anything missing from a basic primate's brain that we have and they don't. So Deacon was fascinated, how does this occur? And this led to this theory that a large element of our evolution in language terms was that the language environment itself speeded up the evolutionary process in our brains. And this is what's meant by the subtitle of his book, the co-evolution of language and our brains. It's the co-evolution in the subtitle. They happen together, and that's sped up. So that there's the natural environment, and there's the environment created by the symbolic world of language. So it's interesting, often in psychology, there's these huge debates about nature versus nurture. And Deacon's, one of his many insights, is that when language is introduced, that's like an artificial nature. It's a new environment. But the difference is we've created it. So, for example, I think he uses the example of beavers and dolphins. They are aquatic mammals that have adapted to a world of water, in obviously the dolphin more than the beaver. And in that instance, they've adapted, but they're adapting to an external environment. What's unique about human beings is we've adapted to an external environment that is then affected profoundly by the language and symbolic manipulations that we've created that feed back into that environment. So in a clumsy way, I think what I'm trying to say is there's no such thing as pure nature anymore, because language is so powerful. It's had its own evolutionary effect on our brains. And that, like I say, I'll go into it. Sounds like a very bold claim, but Deacon traces this whole process in an absolutely fascinating way. So I had to be really careful then to get my face off the screen, because if it compared badly with our ancestors. So you can see the second one in at the top, Australopithecus, was being referred to earlier. And I think Homo habilis, the fourth one on the top, that was the first pre-humanoid to use basic tools. I think I'm right in saying that. Anything I say about anything vaguely scientific and anthropological, please do double check. So you can see how far, if you think of at the top, directly down to Homo sapiens, from 2.4 million years ago, potentially, they don't know exactly, down to Homo sapiens. There's basically 2 million years from the first tool-using human to us, much more dependent upon language. And according to Deacon, it's the tool-using led to the tendency to eat more meat, which then led to the need for stronger social bonds, which then led to this co-evolving interpenetration of language and our environment. It's just a different representation of the same basic thing. But it really does bring home to you how it's like an alas poor Yorick fest, isn't it? But it also brings home to you how absolutely recent Homo sapiens is in the bigger picture. And that's one of Deacon's arguments, given how evolutionary recent we are. The speed with which our brains evolved to use language is one of the things that needs explaining, which his book is all about. And interestingly, his book and his argument runs counter to, I think, most people, when they've heard of linguistics, Noam Chomsky's name springs to mind. And I won't go into all the full details, but just to briefly mention, Noam Chomsky's idea of language is there's a language acquisition device and universal grammar are two of the key ideas he has. And these are inherent in a human brain, which explains how we can quickly adopt language, even as children. And Deacon's quite scathing about this because he basically says that Chomsky's assuming what he needs to prove. And rather, Deacon constructs his whole argument to say that that the human brain is uniquely suited to language because language and that brain have co-evolved together. It's not that there were these pre-existing abilities. The two things can't be separated out. So this is a abstract that Deacon wrote on a journal article paper, and I just wanted to comment briefly. I'm quoting the whole abstract because, again, it's a useful summary of some of the things I'll look to in future. But also, it's one of his occasional references, the word became flesh. So I wanted, because it was a long time ago since I mentioned the Tower of Babel, but I will repeatedly come back, even if it's quite a while, to get through some of the technical material of Deacon. You can start to see intimations of why this has theological significance, potentially, or you can see parallels with theological notions. So there's a whole range of quotes in the Old Testament and New Testament about the Word, and the Word became flesh, and the Word was God, and so on and so on. So this is in Deacon's abstract to his article. The concept of human nature has been challenged by social scientists because of its inability to clearly delineate the distinction between the biologically inherited and the experientially acquired attributes of being human. Yet the very fact of being susceptible to acquired cultural influences, irrelevant to other species, makes clear that this is an evolutionarily constrained susceptibility. So I think what he means by that is we as humans, and I think this goes back to the early quote by Jon Haidt, the way in which teenagers, it all kicked off in 2010-ish, 2012 on that graph. We are uniquely susceptible to acquired cultural influences. And scarily, it seems that those cultural influences, they're evolving ever quicker compared to our ability to deal with them. But what he's emphasizing is yet the very fact of being susceptible to acquired cultural influences. Other animals don't have this. They obviously have societies and groups, but they don't influence each other as profoundly as we do. So to go back to the first sentence, the concept of human nature has been challenged by social scientists because of its inability. This is the nature versus nurture. The first sentence is referring to the nature versus nurture constant controversy. But in his work, as we'll find out, it's going to take a while to get there, so don't shout at me for not being able to give the answers straight away. But Deacon's whole project is to try and say that the nature versus nurture way of thinking about things is a false dichotomy. Nature and nurture, through human symbolic language, have become merged together. And that creates a whole new ballpark. So symbolic processes are the source of the most important and distinctively human-acquired influences, and include both linguistically mediated and habitually reproduced social conventions. So I've been threatening for ages, and I will eventually. I've mentioned in the past books about the way in which the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, used rituals and how rituals were linked with their myths. And that perfectly links with this. Linguistically mediated, in other words, Greek myths, and habitually reproduced social conventions. You couldn't do anything for 5 minutes in ancient Greece without having to sacrifice a poor animal. There was constant ritual sacrifice, and to a lesser extent in Roman times. And classical scholars have traced, Richard Seaforth is the one I typically quote, this inherent link between the ritualized language of myth, the repetition of myths via language, and the grounded nature of rituals in everyday life. And they were seamlessly joined, which helped to reinforce Greek social bonds. And remember, this is Deacon's argument about language from our most primeval origins. The purpose of language is to strengthen bonds. So susceptibility to these influences arose due to the evolution of neurological adaptations that support symbolic communication and cognition. So again, this is the nature-nurture. Susceptibility to these influences, so the influences are external, well, the influences are cultural, coming from the social world around us. But our susceptibility, the ease to which cultural influences affect us, was exacerbated by the changing nature of the human brain. So these two things co-evolved. So although human brains do not include any structures that lap ape homologs, this is what I said earlier, the homology between apes and humans, our brains are essentially the same, yet we can do so much more. The slight reorganization that made symbolic abilities ubiquitous has also created the possibility for socially transmitted information to radically reorganize mental functions. So that's a major element of Deacon's work, as he's showing why, with seemingly almost identical brains, albeit different sizes, why can we do so much more than apes? So he talks about how he reanalyzes the concept of symbolic reference in order to overcome equivocal and ambiguous uses of the concept that obscure the special nature of these adaptations, and thus blind research to the complex biocultural interactions that produce some of the most ubiquitous and unprecedented features of being human. These include modifications of memory functions, emotional experiences, the nature of identity, and the range of mental plasticity. So this is all very wordy, and this is just the abstract, which is supposed to be the clearest summary of the work being done. But I just provided it for you, and I can just do a quick running translation. He's basically arguing in the later part of the essay, and this is something I'll have to do at a future date, the notion of the particular qualities of symbolic reference. He's arguing that when people discuss what a symbol is or what the symbolic reference process is, he argues most scientists and linguists haven't adequately distinguished between what we're about to see now in the next slide, the difference between the icon, the index, and the symbol. So that people have used the terms too interchangeably, and he's arguing they need to be distinguished between. And that last sentence, just before I move on, he argues, and this is an absolute boon to me who've been trying to argue unsuccessfully with lots of people how literacy is so important, how literature and art are so important. But he's basically saying a greater facility with symbolic reference has the effects of include modifications of memory functions, emotional experiences, the nature of identity, and this is my point about young people being confused about their identity, and the range of mental plasticity. So Deacon's arguing that symbolic processes and being more aware of them affects all those areas. In other words, basically every aspect of human life. Now, I'm shamelessly using the phrase triad here because it just sounds better. I don't think the concept of the icon, the index, and the symbol, I might be wrong, but I don't think Charles Sanders Peirce was this early semiotician. And he was well known to an extent, but never really got that much, arguably the recognition he deserved. But Deacon picked up on some of his work and has really run with it. But this semiotic triad, it just reminds me of, in discussions of narcissistic personality disorder, the dark triad. Sounds really ominous and threatening, so I thought I'd use the phrase semiotic triad. But this is what it refers to. So the first element of what I'm calling the semiotic triad is iconicity, so it's physical resemblance. And I've used the picture of a traffic light, and the iconicity in that particular example would be the figure of what looks to be, careful what I say in this day and age, but what looks to be a man on the traffic sign pole. And iconicity, the simple explanation is it's just based upon physical resemblance. And it gets complicated because you could argue, well, that's more, that's not a direct similarity, you could argue. But just pretend that's a really accurate picture of a human being. Then it matches the concept of iconicity. And indexicality is the notion of, so I'm going to give you better examples of all of these. I'm just quickly trying to give you the overview. So iconicity, physical resemblance. So a photograph of someone's face would be a perfect example of iconicity. Indexicality, a direct causal relationship. So a sign of fire would be smoke. There's a direct causal relationship. And then you have the third element, which is symbolism. And the definition's quite complicated because he talks about doubly arbitrary. It's a conventional sign that conventionally represents. So a conventional sign or an arbitrary sign is there's no direct causal relationship. Letters that go together to form a word have no causal relationship with the thing they represent. So the most causal relationship you'll get in normal language is things like onomatopoeia, where a phrase sounds like it's the thing it's representing. But normally, letters in words and words don't look anything like the thing they're supposed to represent. So it's an arbitrary thing. And then how we interpret or how it represents has an extra layer of the arbitrary and the conventional, because how we put words together, we use grammar and syntax. And they're completely arbitrary because they vary between different languages. So it's a double, symbolism is a double laden thing, and I'll explain more as we go along. And I'm sorry I keep saying I'll explain more as I go along, but I'm simultaneously trying to give you the overview and then go into the detail and then come back out and look at the overview. And if there are videos of Terrence Deacon explaining some of these ideas, and I think he writes better than he explains. So if I'm struggling to explain it, it's probably because I'm just a bad explainer. But also, they're just not particularly easy concepts, is the excuse I'm making, and I'm sticking to it. But this is another example of the iconicity. So I've shown this in previous videos, but the René Magritte painting, and it says in French, "This is not a pipe." But it is a pipe, Rene. But then it isn't, because it's a representation of a pipe, and so on and so on. But you can obviously see the direct representation. Was that, it was called The Treachery of Images? I always forget the title for that. But the actual title of the painting is not Ceci n'est pas un pipe. It's, I think it's The Treachery of Images. But this is an example of the indexical, or indexicality. So I'm making myself giggle, because if anyone's familiar with the online, there's lots of YouTube videos of a American comic called Ian Bagg, and he has a whole routine about windsocks that he uses quite often. But anyway, I'm distracting myself. The windsocks is indexical because what it represents is in direct relation to the way the wind is blowing. So in the first instance, the iconicity, the representation is the same as or very similar to the thing it's trying to represent. That's what you're recognizing, is the absolute similarity. What you're recognizing when you see something that's indexical is the relationship of the thing, the sign that's representing, and the thing being represented are combined together. So in this instance, the windsock and the wind are interacting. There's a causal relationship that then tells you which way the wind is blowing, and that's the bit of communication that you're receiving. But in the symbolic realm, that's what you're getting. It's completely arbitrary. So that has nothing to do with a fairy four-legged creature. But the paradox is that allows us to have abstract thoughts and to communicate with other human beings at a much more complex level than the other two. So, for example, with reference to the windsock, it makes me think of, the indexical, so the windsock example, smoke and fire. But try communicate. It's possible to communicate with smoke signals. But try and write a philosophical paper using smoke signals. When they reveal who the new pope is, they use white or black smoke. On a slight tangent, the British Home Secretary, David Lammy, who's not the sharpest tool in the box, but he happens to be black and he's obsessed with race. But he misunderstood the recent election of the Pope, and in a tweet he didn't think, which he never does, but he asked that could people not make it about racism when he saw a comment saying, will it be white or black smoke for the new Pope? But that is an example of the binary. Is it white smoke? Is it black smoke? That is indexical. The type of smoke reveals there's a causality, or it's the most basic form of symbolism contained within indexicality. This is how the categories swap over into each other. But what I'm trying to say is there's a very limited amount you can say with smoke. So at the most basic level, smoke is an index of fire. And if you tried to be symbolic with smoke, you can, for example, tell people a pope's been elected, but that's all you can do. And even then, I remember one instance where the weather was bad and they struggled to see, the smoke turned out grey, and they were trying to work out, well, have they not decided or have they decided? So I'll quickly run through now, because I think you get the basic idea, but this is Deacon describing himself, iconicity. So if, for example, you can see the shape of a face on the moon, he's saying that's an example of iconicity. But iconism can also be highly abstract. A mathematical equation refers iconically once you know how to discern its symbol-mediated isometry. So I hope there's some mathematicians or scientists out there. E.g., between the structure of the interpreted equation and a corresponding geometric or dynamical relationship. So iconicity, I remember doing economics is about the closest I get to hard mathematics. And there's something called ISLN diagrams. It's about the money supply, the supply and demand for money. And you had equations and ISLN diagrams in quadrants, and they all interact. They all interrelated in quite a beautiful mathematical way. And I think that's what's being referred to here. An equation can be interpreted to be iconic, e.g. of a parabolic trajectory. So algebraic equations can equate to geometric shapes, like a parabolic trajectory. Only, however, if you know how to discern the way that differences in the mathematical values or operations directly correspond to the differences in the geometric object of reference. So iconicity isn't... what he's saying is it can be simple correspondence. Does a face look like another face? Does your face look like the face on the moon? Does a photograph look like your face? There's a direct correspondence, but it can be more complicated. So indexical, indices refer by contiguity, and contiguity, I was going to say it means propinquity, but propinquity is a posh word as well. They just basically mean closeness or nearness. So I think I once read a phrase where the single biggest indicator of having the likelihood of a romantic entanglement is propinquity, or it used to be before online dating services took over the world. So the idea is, it used to be the case that your best chance of having a romantic entanglement with someone is not going out to nightclubs and stuff to find someone, but you'd bump into them at work, or they'd live in your neighbourhood, is the notion of propinquity. But anyway, digressing quite badly here. So indices, in other words, things that are indexical, refer by contiguity in space-time or deriving from a common substrata. A simple correlation can therefore be the ground for indexical reference. A lipstick smear on a man's shirt collar can be a troublesome indication to his wife. A urine scent on a branch can be a sexual index to a female lemur. And the mobbing call of a small bird can indicate the presence of a raptor, in other words, a predator. A predator bird. What gets correlated and how accidental cultural evolutionary is arbitrary, but the fact of correlation is not. So again, an icon is based in some clear relationship to reality or correspondence, and so is the indexical. It's related in space-time, or this notion of a common substrata. So the fact of correlation is not up for dispute. What gets correlated, maybe. So he gives an example of a typical scientist's example. So I'm assuming a Skinner box is just what they use in experiments. A rat in a Skinner box, I don't think they're actually skinning the poor rat. A rat in a Skinner box pressing a bar in response to a bell in order to get a water reward has learned that the bell is an index of the state of the apparatus, even though this purring was the whim of an experimenter. The arbitrary purring doesn't make the one a symbol of the other. Repeated purring over the course of generations in the evolution of a species can similarly be the basis for an innate tendency to interpret something indexically. This is the case for the indexicality of the vervet monkey alarm call sound and its correlation with the presence of a type of predator and the urge to engage in an appropriate defense activity or escape behavior. Conventionalized indices are also quite common. For example, the white line painted down the middle of two-lane roads. Though it's a conventionalized sign, it refers indexically, not symbolically. So the indexical is all about relationships of causality. And another way of thinking of iconicity is it's a relationship of similarity. So in nature, what Deacon's explaining here or describing is the way in which these type of methods of communication exist both in human society and in nature quite naturally. So an iconic communication in nature might be there's a certain type of moth. If a bird is about to eat it, will open its wings, and big scary eyes are part of the moth's eye shapes, not literal eyes, but camouflage in the shape of these big eyes. It's not really camouflage if you've got big eyes, is it? Because you can see them. So it's not camouflage. These big eyes on the design of the moth wings are designed to look like big scary eyes. So there's a similarity, there's an iconicity that the moth hopes will scare off the predator. And in this instance, there's also a relationship that animals can learn or they can use for their own self-protection. And in our human society, the white lines in the middle of the road are all about the relationship of distance. There's a causal, factual relationship. And that's why it isn't symbolic. So this is the symbolic. A symbolic reference involves a conventional type of sign vehicle, and just how a sign conveys things, that additionally represents its objects of reference in a conventionally mediated way. Something can be considered symbolic then only if the property determining its relationship to what it refers to is also a convention. And I'll explain very shortly. The easiest way to understand this is things like grammar. You have arbitrary words like dog that bear no relationship to an actual dog. And how we use the word dog in English is predicated upon concepts like verb, noun, subject, object in a sentence. And they are arbitrary, conventionally determined and evolved over time. So you need those two elements of double convention is how Deacon's describing it. So symbols are in this sense doubly conventional. So arbitrarity, I think it's just made up a word, by itself is not diagnostic of symbolic reference, nor can it be a critical defining feature of language. So you basically need two lots of arbitrarity in order to be truly symbolic. Although innate iconicity and indexicality can evolve by natural selection, symbolic reference cannot. This is because of their displacement from features shared with what they represent. And I'm sorry, this is really complicated. I'm going to wrap up shortly. So on another occasion, this can be explained again. So if you're struggling to keep up with all this, don't worry. But I think it's important why Deacon's emphasizing all this is that it goes some way to showing how symbols are unique and they can be differentiated from icons and indexes. And whereas animals can use iconic and indexical communication, they can't use symbolic communication. So all this, like what might seem like, really detailed information about symbols, it might be a bit of a pain in the backside. But actually, it's what is needed for Deacon to then, A, emphasize why symbols are different, and then B, explain why humans use symbols and no other animals do. Or if they do, they do it in an incredibly limited way. So in arguments I've had, people have been trying to say that whales can whistle to each other underwater. It's like some type of subaquatic Celine Dion. And arguing that is exactly the same as human language. And Deacon just, I was going to say blows it out the water, but that's got horrible images of whales being blown out of the water. But hopefully you get what I mean. So symbols lack the reliably repeated associations between properties that natural selection requires. This explains why there are no innate words, only innate calls, like laughter or sobbing. These are linked to reliable emotional states and characteristic external conditions which reliably elicit these states. So again, he's just distinguishing between what's innate and what isn't. So this requirement has other important implications about language evolution, however, that are not generally recognized. Grammatical rules are even more abstract and less reliably correlated with anything in the brain or in the world than are words. In particular, the surface properties of utterances that provide the grammatical and syntactic information, so syntax being about the placement of words, not just the grammatical rules, but the position of where words need to be, and the syntactic information required to interpret a sentence are even less directly correlated with any physical property or relation in the world than are words. So they should be even less likely to arise as a product of biological evolution. So this is Deacon explaining it truly is remarkable that we've evolved so quickly to use language, because the qualities of symbols and their arbitrary and conventional nature are nearly totally socially derived. And yet, that social quality, remember earlier he said human beings are uniquely susceptible to social influence because other animals beyond basic social groups do not influence each other symbolically the way we do. So this profoundly non-natural, incredibly abstract notion of a symbol is the very thing we use to bind ourselves together in the real world. So we're bound together very closely in the real world, and it's affected how our brains work, is what Deacon goes on to argue. And yet, that makes it incredibly unlikely that it would be a natural part of natural biological evolution. So he's doing something quite complicated. Deacon's suggesting that language has evolved as part of the way the brain has evolved, and they've basically co-evolved in an incredibly intertwined way. And this is what I meant earlier by suggesting Deacon's analysis of symbols breaks down the nature versus nurture distinction. And that allows him to start talking about human nature in a way previously social scientists didn't like to talk about it. Because human nature now becomes this complex mix of our natural evolution, and our natural evolution being fueled by the evolution of the thing that we socially created, which was language, which isn't biological, but has massively affected our biological development through our grouping in social groups that use symbolic language. And around we go in this incredibly complex intertwining. So although there can be no innate symbols, there can be evolution to make the acquisition and use of symbolic communication comparatively easy. In turn, however, the regular use of symbolic communication and reasoning over our protracted evolutionary past as a symbolic species has almost certainly changed the ways we humans use even those cognitive abilities that long predate our symbolic awakening. So he's saying what I clumsily said just before, that what's unique about symbolic communication is that it's actually managed to make use of those cognitive abilities that long predate our symbolic awakening. So he's suggesting that language has taken what pre-hominoids would have and merged with those qualities to produce something that evolution on its own couldn't do in that timescale. So these evolved modifications of human mental capacities have given rise to an unprecedented symbolic niche, or as you would say in North America, niche. I much prefer niche, by the way. Culture that forms the ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem in which we develop in response to. This atypically modified neurology and radically restructured social ecological context together are responsible for the unprecedented deviation of human biology from the biology of effectively every other species on Earth. So I wished I'd had this quote when I was arguing with people about, oh, well, Wales, it's just another form of language, and, humans just do it a little bit better. Well, no. This is a neuroscientist, evolutionary anthropologist, quite clearly stating that human biology heralded an unprecedented deviation from the biology of effectively every other species on Earth. He's not being very ambiguous there. So the virtual semiotic world of symbols in which we live and to which we have been innately predisposed and developmentally shaped has produced what I describe as our distinctive human symbolic nature. And this is where I'm going to finish with just what are the implications. So Deacon's describing here this virtual semiotic world of symbols. And I'll develop that in future videos. And I also think, to go right back to the beginning of this talk, this has links with what Jon Haidt was talking about. Arguably, the virtual semiotic world of symbols, Deacon's been describing basically the evolution of how we got where we got when Jon Haidt then starts talking about everything seemed to go a bit wrong from around about 2012. I'd suggest because this semiotic world of symbols, we've lost some of our ability to deal with it because of the new technological forms. And one of the consequences of those new technological forms is the loss of the literacy that I've been arguing on this channel is what helps us process our own human existence and come to terms with it better. And to put that in hopefully clearer terms, this notion of sickness unto death is a phrase, it's a book by Soren Kierkegaard. And one of the aspects, what are the implications of all this stuff that Deacon's talking about, the relevance of the symbolic realm? Ultimately, where's the beef? Why does it matter? And it goes to this idea that when Deacon claims, when you have a virtual symbolic world that we've created, this world of language, art, and literature, it helps us or makes us think about our own mortality, and it helps us or makes us philosophize about things that may be a bit unpleasant. And I'd suggest that anxiety, the things that Jon Haidt's talking about, social anxiety, teenagers struggling more than they ever have historically in the way that he traces and investigates as a social psychologist. This relates to, it might sound so unrelated, but Soren Kierkegaard, when he's talking about the concept of anxiety, was another one of his books, The Sickness Unto Death, Fear and Trembling. All these books, he's talking in theological terms. And because young people don't have theology, they don't have art and literature, they're suffering the sickness unto death, this fear of, they may not even know they're worrying about their own mortality, but what they might be worrying about, like I said, young people don't worry about mortality, but what they do worry about is their own identity. And when Deacon describes how social groupings are helped massively, that's why we evolved to have language, our sense of identity within the group has been massively overdetermined by the rise of language. When you lose facility with language, well, guess what? You lose the ability to see your own identity. You struggle with it. This goes to the Mark Edmondson quote about speaking like a tape machine. Bit of a dated reference when he talks about tapes. But this is why young people aspire to speak like the influencers, who are the social media platforms that Jonathan Haidt's talking about. Those platforms reaching to the sky of social prestige and click numbers, like the Tower of Babel. I knew we'd get back to the Tower of Babel in the end. I had faith in myself, even if you didn't. So this is towards the end of the actual book, Symbolic Species. Knowledge of death, of the inconceivable possibility that the experiences of life will end, is a datum, or a fact, that only symbolic representation can impart. Not a fact, a piece of information, a datum. So no feature of the limbic system, I think he's referring to, has evolved to handle this ubiquitous virtual sense of loss. Indeed, I wonder if this isn't one of the most maladaptive of the serendipitous consequences of the evolution of symbolic abilities. What great efforts we exert trying to forget our future fate by submerging the constant angst with innumerable distractions. So Deacon himself is suggesting our use of language as humans has this downside. It creates a sense of distance and abstraction and loss. And what adolescents that Jonathan Haidt's describing, their anxiety, I'd suggest, is fueled by they're living in this virtual realm of social media communication without any of the centuries-long traditions and skills that learning to deal with literary abstractions has taught people. So they're cast alone on this sea of communicational plenitude, this fullness, this Noah's flood of images and information. Yet they've never been less skilled in navigating or using an oar, or whichever maritime analogy or metaphor you'd like to use. So what great efforts we exert trying to forget our future fate by submerging the constant angst with innumerable distractions. So that constant angst and the need for innumerable distractions, I think, points to what Jonathan Haidt's researching with reference to adolescence. Whereas the over 50s, as the graph showed, we've never been happier. So this idea of how you imagine yourself, I think this backs up what I've just been saying. This notion of signs, not symbols. I'm arguing that young people in the new Tower of Babel, the social media platforms they've climbed aboard and are reaching for the sky of influencer's godly status, that self-imagination is what Mark Edmondson was describing as, it's this tautological, they speak like a machine because they're using language that's been given to them. They're being spoken by the language. They're not speaking language themselves. So they're losing symbolic richness, and all they're left with are these empty, vacuous signs. God, I'm cheery today. So the savant-like compulsion to see symbols in everything reaches its almost irresistible expression when it comes to the symbolization of our own lives' end. We inevitably imagine ourselves as symbols, as tokens of a deeper discourse of the world. But symbols are subject to being rendered meaningless by contradiction, and this makes alternative models of the world direct threats to existence. So I think this actually goes to, I've italicized and emboldened this, where it says, and as tokens of a deeper discourse of the world. I think what Jonathan Haidt is referring to are tokens of a shallower discourse of the world. And I think the adolescent Jonathan Haidt's talking about was this rendered meaningless by contradiction. And this makes alternative models of the world direct threats to existence. So adolescents are living in this angst-ridden world where there isn't enough meaning to feel rooted. And they're feeling their symbols are subject to being rendered meaningless by contradiction. And alternative models of the world direct threats to existence. So if you have a strong symbolic grounding, it's still vulnerable to being contradicted. So the rise of, very nefarious political movements in the 20th century that caused the world wars, whether it was in Germany or the Soviet Union. That level of symbolism, everyone is vulnerable to it. But the question I'd ask you to ponder is how much more vulnerable are the adolescents Jonathan Haidt's writing about? Because at least when we inevitably imagine ourselves as symbols, as tokens of a deeper discourse of the world, if you buy into a religion or an ideology, at least that helps you root yourself, anchor yourself in the world. And yes, it's vulnerable to misuse. You can end up in a cult, you can be a fundamentalist religious person rather than open to all life's complexities, but at least you have a sense of identity. I'm arguing that what he's describing here, Jonathan Haidt's adolescents don't even have tokens of a deeper discourse. They have tokens of a shallow, empty, influencer-type world. So this self-understanding and symbolic compulsion, this is the flip side. So symbolic compulsion, I would argue, is a deeper way to gain self-understanding, but still it's vulnerable to misuse. So almost certainly this is one of the other defining features of the human mentality, this notion of symbolic compulsion. An ever-present virtual experience of our own loss. And yet we know so little about what it is that we fear to lose. Perhaps if we understood this symbolic compulsion and the consciousness it brings with it, we might find this emptiness at the centre a bit less disturbing. So this isn't a particularly optimistic conclusion. But what Deacon's saying is we have a compulsion towards symbolic understanding. We have a compulsion to constructing symbolic theologies, symbolic political ideologies. That's what our brains are now co-evolved with language to produce. But because they're abstract, and because although they influence the world, they're not rooted in the iconic or the indexical, they're rooted in the symbolic abstract. That makes them amazingly powerful and adaptable and imaginative and creative, but it also feeds into this notion of an ever-present virtual experience of our own loss, because these abstract symbolic systems encourage us to think of our own mortality, which Kierkegaard has pointed out in depth, and Deacon points to himself. This is the maladaptive evolutionary response. We start thinking about our own mortality. But more generally, all these mental constructions we create are susceptible to a sense of loss, a sense of we're not sure. I suppose the religious equivalent is to having your faith challenged or temporarily losing your faith, because it's a psychological and abstract and or an emotional commitment that's open to threats from the outside and to feelings of loss. So perhaps if we understood the symbolic compulsion and the consciousness it brings with it, we might find this emptiness at the centre a bit less disturbing. So this again, to go back to the Nietzsche idea of the birth of tragedy, the Greek dramatic form of tragedy helps to deal with this symbolic compulsion and the consciousness it brings. So guess what? The Greek tragedies are not cheery at all. They're full of the emptiness of fate and the terrible things that happen to the protagonists in Greek tragic plays. But arguably Nietzsche's claiming that was the Greek way of dealing with some of life's existential questions. And figures like George Steiner and other people, that the tragedy of modern times, of contemporary times, is we've lost a sense of the tragic. We've lost a sense of, notwithstanding all the worry of loss that Deacon's saying is a consequence of symbolic structures, those same symbolic structures, learning sophisticated symbolic structures through art and literature, allow us to at least, whether it's theology, whether it's aesthetic appreciation of art and literature, they allow us at least to have a foothold in dealing with this emptiness at the centre, and it helps us make it find it's a bit less disturbing. So on that note, I'll finish with one of my favourite paintings of all time, which I think illustrates that very last comment. So I understand this has been a long and complicated, and maybe I've bitten off more than I can chew and you can chew. But if it hasn't given you intellectual indigestion, I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I'll finish with one last image. Till the next time, all the very best and take care.